The box was sitting on her pillow when she came back from scrubbing the third-floor bathroom. Amara Osei noticed it the same way she noticed everything in this house. Carefully, quietly, without making a sound that might draw attention to herself. It was small, black velvet, the kind jewelers use for things that cost more than a rent. She set down her cleaning caddy and stared at it the way you stare at something that doesn't belong, something that makes the air in the room feel slightly wrong. There was a note beneath it. 3 words in precise, cold handwriting. Where tonight? No please. No explanation. No signature. As if only one person in this entire 12,000 square foot Seoul estate could issue a command that blunt and expect it to be obeyed without question. Amara had worked for Kang Ji-hoon for 4 months. In that time, he had spoken to her directly exactly 11 times. She had counted, not because she was keeping score, but because each conversation had been so clipped, so deliberately stripped of warmth, that they stood out in her memory the way cold water stands out in a warm room. The East Wing floors need resealing. The kitchen staff arrives at 6. Do not enter the study under any circumstances. That last one he had said twice, which she supposed counted as 12. She opened the box. The ring inside made her breath catch. It was a single pear-cut diamond, colorless and enormous, set in a band of white gold that had been etched with a pattern so delicate she had to hold it to the light to see it. 2 serpents intertwined, each swallowing the other's tail. It was the kind of object that carried history inside it, the kind that had been touched by hands she would never know. She thought about setting it back on the pillow and walking out of the room, out of the estate, out of this entire arrangement that had never quite made sense to her anyway. Most people would have done exactly that. Amara didn't. She had taken this job because she had no other option, and she was honest enough with herself to admit it. 3 months earlier, she had been a junior archivist at a private cultural foundation in Nairobi. A job she'd loved, a job that had evaporated overnight when the foundation's director had embezzled the endowment and fled the country. She had followed her cousin to Seoul, planning to stay 3 weeks, maybe find freelance translation work. She spoke 4 languages, which she'd always thought would be an asset anywhere. It turned out 4 languages and no Korean work visa were a combination that opened very few doors. The domestic staffing agency had been the cousin's idea. It's just temporary, the cousin had said. Rich people's houses, good pay, no one bothers you. The agency had placed her immediately, which she should have questioned. High placement rate positions in private estates usually meant high turnover. People didn't leave good situations quickly. She hadn't asked why the last housekeeper had left. She needed the salary deposit by Friday. The estate was in Songbuk-dong, old money neighborhood, old stone walls, the kind of silence that feels purchased rather than natural. The man who'd interviewed her had not been Kang Ji-hoon. It had been a compact, watchful man named Secretary O, who had asked her 3 questions about cleaning protocols, 2 about discretion, and 1 about whether she had any family in Korea. When she'd said no, he had handed her a contract and told her she could start Monday. She had signed it before she finished reading it. The clause about never discussing the household with outside parties seemed standard. The clause about surrendering her phone for a replacement device. For security, the agency assures compliance with all relevant privacy regulations, had made her pause for exactly 30 seconds before she decided she was overthinking it. For months later, she knew she hadn't been overthinking it at all. She just hadn't yet understood what kind of house she was living in. She put the ring on at 7:15, standing in front of the small mirror in her room on the staff floor. It fit perfectly, which was strange enough that she turned it on her finger twice, as if checking for some trick. Her hands were not small. Whoever had worn this ring before her had hands nearly the same size, the same shape. The diamond caught the overhead light and threw it across the ceiling in fractured patterns. The ring felt heavier than its size suggested. She walked downstairs. The estate's main hall had been transformed in the hours she'd spent on the upper floors. The furniture she dusted weekly had been repositioned, replaced in some cases, 24 chairs arranged around a long table she had never seen before, lacquered black, enormous, the kind of table that required a team to carry. Candles burned in tall glass holders. The art on the walls, Modern pieces she'd always assumed were decorative had been covered with silk panels in deep burgundy. 12 men stood at the table's edges. Another 20 or so positioned throughout the room, standing still in the particular way that men stand when they're paid to stand perfectly still. Security. She recognized the posture because she'd seen it every day for 4 months, the way Secretary O's shadow staff moved through the estate, present without being visible, watching without appearing to watch. She had not known there would be this many people. She had not known there would be any people. What she understood in that moment was that she had walked directly into the center of something she had been carefully kept outside of for months, and that the box on her pillow had not been an invitation. It had been a placement. Kang Jae-hun stood at the far end of the table. She had seen him nearly every day for 4 months, but she had never seen him like this. He wore a dark suit that had clearly been made for his body and no one else's, and he stood with the absolute stillness of a man who has never once in his adult life been required to fill silence by moving. His face was what it always was, symmetrical, controlled, the kind of handsome that had been stripped of all warmth so that it wouldn't be mistaken for invitation. His eyes found her the moment she entered the room. They did not move from her. She crossed the hall toward him because there was no other direction that made sense, and because she had learned in 4 months that Kang Jae-hun did not repeat his instructions. She stopped 3 feet from him. He looked at her hand, at the ring. Something moved across his face so quickly she almost missed it. Not surprise, not satisfaction. Something older than both of those things. Something that had been locked behind his eyes for a very long time and had just, for one unguarded second, pressed against the glass. Then it was gone. "Stand here," he said. "Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not explain who you are." She stared at him. "You haven't explained who I am." "No," he said. "I haven't." The guests arrived over the following 20 minutes. Amara stood where she'd been placed, slightly behind and to the left of Jae-hun's chair, and she watched them come in with the calm attention she'd developed as an archivist, cataloging details, filing them, waiting for a pattern to emerge. They were older men, mostly, powerful in the particular way that Korean patriarchs carry power, which is quietly, heavily, like something sewn into the fabric of their suits. They came with younger men behind them, assistants or sons or something in between. They greeted Jae-hun with the deference of people who are powerful themselves and are choosing to signal that they recognize someone more powerful. Small bows, precise, calibrated to the millimeter. Then they saw her. The first man to notice stopped so completely that the man behind him walked into his shoulder. He said something in Korean too rapid for her limited vocabulary to follow. Jae-hun answered in 2 words. The man's eyes went to the ring on her finger, and the color left his face so thoroughly and suddenly that Amara thought for a moment he might be having a medical event. He wasn't. He bowed. Not the small calculated bow he'd given Jae-hun. Something deeper. Something that came from his knees. She didn't understand it. She didn't understand any of what followed. The ripple that moved through the room as each man noticed what the first man had noticed. The whispers that circulated with the speed and urgency of fire. The way every pair of eyes in the room moved from her face to her hand, and back again with an expression she could only describe as bewilderment. And then one by one, in the order that she would later understand reflected their precise rank within the organization, they bowed. Not to Jae-hun, to her. There are moments in life when the ground shifts beneath you and you have no idea why. She was standing in the middle of one of those moments, and she had no framework, no context, no map. All she knew was that the ring on her finger meant something she hadn't been told, and that Kang Jae-hun, standing 2 feet away from her, was watching it happen with an expression she couldn't read. Secretary O appeared at her elbow during the dinner course, which she had not been invited to eat, but had been positioned to observe, a distinction that was beginning to make a specific kind of sense. "You have questions," he said quietly. "About 40, she said. "The ring belonged to Kang Soo-yeon," he said. "Mr. Kang's late wife. She died 3 years ago." Amara waited. He paused, chose a word with the care of someone defusing something. "Significant to all of these families. Not only as Mr. Kang's wife. Her own family founded the compact that governs how these organizations interact with each other. The 7 families. She was the last of her line. What compact? An agreement made 40 years ago. The family swore collective protection to Soo-Yun's bloodline. When she died without children, that protection, he stopped again. It became an open question. A wound, you might say. Each family has spent 3 years maneuvering around the absence of what they all swore to protect. Amara looked at the ring. And if someone is wearing her ring? The compact doesn't specify blood, Secretary O said. Only the ring and the recognition of the head of the Kong family. If Mr. Kong recognizes someone as standing in Soo-Yun's place, he let the sentence end where it was. She turned and looked at Ji-hun across the table. He was already looking at her. He didn't tell me any of this, she said. No, Secretary O agreed. He didn't. She found him after the last guest had left, in the courtyard garden at the back of the estate, the one she wasn't technically permitted to clean because it required a separate code. The door was open. She walked through it. He was standing with his back to her, looking at a stone garden that had been arranged with the kind of precision that suggested it had been designed to hold grief rather than beauty. You used me, she said. He didn't turn around. Yes. She had expected denial, or redirection, not that single, flat syllable of confirmation, offered without apology, as if he considered guilt and inefficiency. You put that ring on my pillow without telling me what it meant. You stood me in front of 40 men who then, she stopped. You had no right. Now he turned. His face in the garden light was different from his face in the house. Less contained. The angles were the same, but something beneath them had loosened slightly, the way a fist loosens after a long time, not fully open, but no longer closed. I know, he said. That's not an explanation. No, it's not. She crossed her arms. She had a talent for silence. She'd learned it young, in classrooms where being the only black girl meant that filling silence too eagerly made you a target, and staying silent made you invisible, and the narrow space between those two things was where you learned to simply wait. She deployed it now. He broke first. Soo-Yun has been gone for 3 years, he said. In that time, 2 of the 7 families have moved to dissolve the compact. 3 others have stayed neutral out of self-interest, not loyalty. The remaining 2 have remained faithful, but are weakening under pressure. He paused. The compact isn't simply an agreement. It is the architecture that prevents those 7 organizations from destroying each other and every civilian structure within their reach. Without it, he stopped. Without it what? Without it, we return to what we were before my wife's family built it, which was not something any of you, he caught himself, restarted, which was not something the city survives intact. She stared at him. So you needed a body to put the ring on. Something crossed his face. No. Then what? He was quiet for a long moment. The garden held the silence with him, the soft sound of water somewhere beneath the stones. Soo-Yun told me, he said finally, that if she died before me, I would know her replacement when I met her. She said. He paused. She watched him choose, carefully, whether to say the next part. She said the woman would carry a specific kind of strength, the kind that comes from being underestimated so many times that it stopped breaking her and started building her instead. Amara was very still. She was from a mixed lineage herself, he continued. Her grandmother was Nigerian. Did you know that? No one does. It was not considered, his jaw tightened. It was not considered advantageous, in these circles, to acknowledge it. She spent her entire life watching people look past her. She spent it learning exactly how much power lives in being looked past. The ground was doing that shifting thing again. She told you to find someone black? Amara asked carefully. She told me to find someone specific. She described. He stopped again, and this time the hesitation wasn't strategic. It was something raw pressing against a very long habit of suppression. She described, with some precision, a person I would eventually employ without recognizing the significance of until too late. How long have you known? He didn't answer. Ji-hun. How long? The 2nd week, he said quietly. She stared at him. She thought about 4 months of cold instructions and careful distance, and a man who never looked at her for longer than was necessary, and she recalibrated every single one of those memories against what he just told her. She thought about the way you feel when you realize the situation was never quite what you thought it was. When the person who seemed to be ignoring you turns out to have been watching you so carefully, they could have described your habits in their sleep. You were afraid, she said, not as an accusation, as a discovery. He didn't deny it. She was everything, he said. Every structure I built after her death, I built to protect what she created. And then you walked into my house, and you were so, he stopped, breathed, started again. You were so clearly what she had described that I didn't know what to do with it. So you kept me at arm's length for 4 months. I was not ready. And tonight, he said, 2 of the families that want the compact dissolve sent representatives to this gathering with instructions to make their final move. If I had arrived at that table without a clear answer to the question of succession, he paused. The compact would have ended before morning. She turned the ring on her finger. You still should have told me. Yes, he said. I should have. I'm not her, Amara said. I need you to understand that. Whatever she described, whatever you think you saw in me, I am my own person, and I am not a replacement for someone you lost. I know, he said. And then, very quietly, that is also something she told me to remember. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in her bed on the staff floor with the ring on her bedside table, and she turned the conversation over and over the way you turn a stone to look for what's underneath it. She thought about what it meant to be placed into a role without consent. She thought about what it meant to be seen, genuinely seen, by someone who had then spent months trying not to act on it. She thought about a woman she had never met, a woman with a Nigerian grandmother and a strategic mind, and apparently the foresight of someone who had spent her life watching the architecture of power from the outside, who had left her husband instructions she'd somehow known he'd need. She thought about what Secretary O hadn't finished saying. The compact doesn't specify blood. She thought about 40 men bowing. She thought about what you could do with that. The call came at 4 in the morning. She heard it through the wall. Not the words, just the tone. Jehun's voice, which was always controlled, hitting a register she hadn't heard before. She was out of bed and in the hallway in 30 seconds, years of sleeping lightly in a place that wasn't home, making her reflexes faster than thought. She heard the word assassin in Korean, one of the 11 words she'd picked up in 4 months, for reasons that now felt more sensible than they had. She knocked once on his study door and opened it before he answered. He was standing behind his desk, phone in hand, and the expression on his face when he looked up at her was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from him. Not fear, something adjacent to fear. The face of a man who has just discovered that a situation has accelerated past the edge of his planning. They sent someone, he said. For you? He looked at the ring on his bedside table, which she'd left there. His eyes came back to her. For you. She thought about the 4 months she'd spent in this house, thinking she was invisible. Turns out, the ring had made her the most visible person in the room, and someone had already decided that was a problem. She was not, contrary to what the next several hours might suggest, afraid. This surprised her slightly when she checked. She had expected fear and found instead a kind of concentrated clarity, the same thing that had carried her through the foundation's collapse, through the visa problems, through the signing of a contract she hadn't finished reading. A quality she never had a good word for that function like a compass, not pointing toward safety, but toward the next correct action. The next correct action was information. Who sent them? She asked. Park Dong-jun, Jehun said. Second family. He's been working to dissolve the compact for 2 years. Tonight he saw me recognize you, and he stopped. He moved faster than I expected. How fast? The man is already inside the outer wall. She processed this. Is there a safe room? Yes. Then why are we standing here? He moved then, and she followed. And the next 12 minutes were a calibrated, controlled movement through the house with Secretary O and 2 others she'd never been introduced to, but who clearly knew their jobs. The safe room was below the wine cellar, which made a specific kind of sense, below the thing that would already be reinforced, tucked inside layers of infrastructure. It was not a comfortable room. It had been built for survival, not comfort. Fluorescent light, concrete walls, a steel door that Secretary O sealed from the inside with a sound like a vault closing. Jehun stood in the center of the room and looked at her. Are you all right? He asked. I'm standing in a bunker at 4 in the morning because someone wants to kill me for wearing a ring, she said. Define all right. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was the closest thing to a smile she'd ever seen from him. Fair, he said. They talked for 3 hours. Not strategy. Secretary O and the others handled that. Moving in and out with updates, coordinating through encrypted channels, managing the situation above them with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this before. She and Jahun talked the way people talk when they've been stripped of pretense by circumstance, when there's nothing left to hide behind, and the question of who you are becomes the most pressing one in the room. He told her about Soo-yeon, not the mythology version, the real version. A woman who had loved literature and hated formal dinners and argued with him about architecture for 3 consecutive hours, once over a building she felt he'd renovated incorrectly. A woman who had understood power as a tool and wielded it with the kind of precision that makes other people think it's effortless until they try it themselves. A woman who had known, with the quiet certainty she brought to everything, that she was going to die before him, and had spent the last 18 months of her life arranging what she left behind. Amara told him about herself. The real version of that, too. The archivist work, which she loved because archives are the places where the stories that didn't get told officially are stored. The way she developed 4 languages, not because she was a prodigy, but because being able to understand what people said when they thought you couldn't was a form of protection she discovered early and never stopped using. The cousin. The agency. The contract she'd signed without finishing. You knew you were signing something you didn't fully understand, he said. I needed the money by Friday. He was quiet for a moment. I will have the contract reviewed. Any clause that. I know my rights, she said. What I'm saying is I made a calculated choice. I do that. It doesn't always look like calculation from the outside, but it always is. She paused. The question I should have asked was why the placement was so fast. Would you have taken the position if you'd known what this house was? She thought about it honestly. Probably not. And now? She turned the ring over in her hand. She'd picked it up off the bedside table when they'd moved, some instinct she didn't fully understand. Now I know what the ring means, she said. And I know what 40 men bowing means. And I know what it means that someone tried to have me killed within 12 hours of me putting it on. She looked at him. The woman who left you these instructions, she didn't choose someone passive. She chose someone who would understand that power is a decision. He watched her. Yes. So I'm making one, she said. Tell me everything. Not the version you decide. I need to know. Everything. The compact, the families, the betrayal you mentioned. All of it. Because if I'm going to be in this position, I'm going to understand it. And then I'm going to decide what to do with it. He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she was beginning to recognize. The one where he was choosing between the man he'd built and the man behind him. He chose the second one. There is a betrayal at the origin of the compact, he said. One that Soo-yeon discovered in the last year of her life. One that would fundamentally change every family's understanding of how the agreement was formed and what they actually owe. He paused. She didn't expose it while she was alive because she wanted to choose the right moment. The right person. Amara held the ring in her palm. She chose me. She chose whoever I would recognize, he said. Which is you? Tell me. The betrayal was 40 years old, and it was architectural. The compact had been presented to the 7 families as an agreement rooted in mutual interest, a recognition that the violence between them was destroying the infrastructure they all depended on, a framework for coexistence. Soo-yeon's grandfather had brokered it, a man named Baek Jun-suk, patriarch of the Baek family, now represented by the man whom most wanted the compact dissolved. Park Dong-juin's father-in-law had co-signed as the second founding voice. The story, as it had been told for 40 years, was that both men had come to the table in good faith. Soo-yeon had found the original documents. Baek Jun-suk had not come in good faith. He had come knowing that the compact's terms contained a provision that had been deliberately mistranslated in the copies given to 5 of the 7 families. A provision that, read correctly, gave the founding families a structural advantage in any dissolution vote. He had helped design the mistranslation. He had spent 40 years collecting obligations from families who didn't know the agreement they'd actually signed. Soo-yeon's grandfather had not known. He had been betrayed by his co-signatory. The entire compact, everything he'd built, everything his granddaughter had inherited, had been undermined at its foundation by the man standing beside him. The original documents, with the correct translation annotated in Soo-yeon's handwriting, were in a sealed deposit at a bank in Myeongdong, accessible only by the head of the Kong family and whoever he formally recognized as standing in the ring succession. She left the documents so that whoever came after her could use them, Amara said. Yes, not to destroy the compact. No, to rebuild it on an honest foundation. To expose what Baek Jun-suk did so that the families were deceived understand what they've been operating under and can renegotiate with full information. He paused. Park Dong-jun has been pushing to dissolve the compact, partly out of greed and partly because his father-in-law told him that dissolution was the only way to escape the provisions of the original agreement. He doesn't know that those provisions are fraudulent. He's been protecting a crime he doesn't know exists. Amara was quiet for a long time. If he knew, she said slowly, he might not want dissolution at all. He might want something different entirely. He might want the man who deceived his family held accountable. Jae-hoon looked at her. Yes, Baek Jun-suk is still alive, 83, still nominally at the head of his family. She stood up. She walked the length of the concrete room, which wasn't far, and then walked it back. She was thinking about archives, about the places where true stories are stored while convenient versions circulate, about what it means to have access to the real document when everyone else has been handed a copy. She was thinking about what you can do with that. Arrange a meeting, she said. All 7 families. Not here, neutral ground. Make it public enough that no one can move against anyone without consequence. She paused. And get me to that bank. It took 6 days to arrange. 6 days during which she remained in the estate, not hiding, but working, which was different. Secretary Oh taught her the relevant Korean vocabulary with the patient efficiency of a man repurposing existing skills. She read Soo-yeon's documents, the ones Jae-hoon had copies of, and she understood them not because she spoke Korean fluently, but because she understood the architecture of agreements, which was her professional foundation. She made notes. She prepared. She and Jae-hoon moved through those 6 days in the particular way of 2 people who have exchanged real information and are now navigating the changed landscape of knowing each other. He brought her coffee without being asked, which was the first spontaneous thing she'd seen him do. She corrected his English in a report he was drafting, without apologizing for doing it, and he revised the document without comment, which she took as acknowledgement. He did not say anything soft or declarative. That wasn't how he worked. She was learning. He communicated through action, through the 10,000 small decisions that constitute presence, through choosing her judgment when he had other options. When she said she wanted to speak at the gathering herself, without Secretary O translating, he arranged Korean language sessions twice a day for 6 days. When she said she wanted to see the original documents in person before the meeting, he drove her to the bank himself. Standing in a private viewing room with 40-year-old paper in her hands, Soo-yeon's handwriting running along the margins in clear annotated lines, she felt the particular feeling of holding something that belongs in the record. The thing that had been removed from the archive and was now back in the light. She looked at Jae-hoon across the table. She was remarkable, Amara said. Yes, he said. So are you. She looked back at the documents. There are times when the truth has been buried for so long that the people holding the lie have forgotten they're holding it. What happened in that room with 7 of the most powerful men in the Korean underworld was the moment the record was corrected. And it was not Kang Jae-hoon who corrected it. It was her. The gathering was at a private hotel in Gangnam, a conference room on the 32nd floor with a view of the city that felt like a statement. 7 families, 7 patriarchs or their representatives, which in 2 cases were sons, and in 1 case a daughter who sat with the contained watchfulness of someone who has spent years observing and is ready, finally, to do something with what she's seen. Amara wore the ring. She stood at the head of the table in a dark dress she'd chosen herself. Not the estate's wardrobe, not anything supplied to her, something that was hers, And she looked at the room and thought about every meeting she'd been in where the person everyone was really listening to wasn't the one holding the official title. She had prepared remarks in Korean. She delivered them in Korean. The precision wasn't perfect. She had told Jehun this, and he had said, in his flat, accurate way, that imperfect sincerity carries more weight than perfect performance. So she delivered her imperfect Korean with every gram of sincerity she had. She told them about the documents, not in a threatening way, in the way of an archivist returning something that had been misfiled. She told them what Baek Jun-suk had done. She told them what he had taken from them. Not money, not territory, but accurate information about what they had actually agreed to. She told them that the compact they had been operating under was built on a lie inserted by one of its founders, and that the families who had been deceived had a legitimate claim to a renegotiation. She put the documents on the table. The room was so quiet she could hear the ventilation system. Park Dong-juin's representative, not the man himself, who was currently dealing with a warrant that had materialized coincidentally that morning, courtesy of an anonymous tip and documentation Jehun had never mentioned he possessed, looked at the papers for a long time, looked at the ring, looked at her. Then he looked at the daughter across the table, the one who had been watching. They exchanged something wordless. He picked up the documents. He read them carefully. He set them back down. Renegotiation, he said. In English, she noticed so that there could be no ambiguity. What terms? She didn't negotiate that day. She proposed something she'd been building in her mind for a week, a restructured compact with a permanent arbitration structure, a rotating chair drawn from the families. In a rotation she designed to prevent any single group from accumulating the kind of structural advantage Baek Jun-suk had engineered. She proposed a document repository, managed jointly, where the actual signed agreements would be held by a neutral third party. She proposed that the ring not be passed by blood or by recognition of the Kong family's head. Then how? The watching daughter asked. She was the only one who'd asked a follow-up question, which told Amara something. By the compact itself, Amara said, whoever the compact's member families collectively recognize as guardian, not a dynasty. A role, an office. She paused. An office that doesn't have to belong to someone who was born into this world. The silence was different from the first silence. It had texture in it. The texture of men who are accustomed to thinking in one shape, encountering the edge of a different shape. Jehun, seated to her left, not at the head of the table, to her left, which had been her suggestion, said nothing. He had said nothing for the entirety of her presentation. He had been absolutely still and completely present in the way that she had finally understood was his form of absolute attention. We need 3 days, one of the other patriarchs said, to consult. Of course, Amara said. She gathered her papers with the calm of someone who has already decided that however this goes, she's done the right thing. I'll be available. She and Jehun drove back in silence. It was a different silence from the ones they'd occupied before. Those had been spaces defined by what was being withheld. This one was full of something that hadn't yet been named. He spoke first. You changed the ending. What do you mean? Soo-yeon's plan, he said. The documents were meant to be used to strengthen the compact as it existed, to correct the foundation but maintain the structure. He paused. You dismantled the structure and built something else. She looked out the window at Seoul moving past. Was that wrong? He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. It was better. She turned toward him. In the car's low light his face was, for once, entirely readable. Or maybe she'd just gotten better at reading it. She could see what had been there for months, behind the controlled surface. What she'd sensed in the second week, when he'd looked at her for a fraction too long over a cleaning schedule. You could have told me what I was walking into, she said. Not the night of the gathering. Earlier. Months earlier. I know. You chose not to. I was afraid, he said, of several things. Including, he stopped. Including that if I told you, you would make an informed decision to leave, and I was not ready for that. She sat with that for a moment. The car moved through the city. You're telling me now, she said. You're harder to lie to than most people, he said. I've noticed this for 4 months. Because I watch. Because you see, he said, there's a difference. The compact was restructured. It took 3 weeks of negotiation, 2 lawyers who asked no unnecessary questions, and 1 very long meeting with a watching daughter, whose name, Amara learned, was Shin Myri, and who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening for 7 years, who became, along with Amara, the co-architects of the new arbitration structure. Baek Jun-suk's family submitted to a quiet internal reckoning. He was not prosecuted. He was 83, and the calculation of what prosecution would cost in terms of destabilization was made, and Amara was part of making it, which was something she thought about carefully. She had entered a world with its own logic, its own forms of justice that were not identical to the forms she'd grown up with. She didn't pretend they were the same. She did insist on a full written acknowledgement, signed, entered into the document repository she'd proposed, so that the record was correct. Archives matter. She'd spent her whole life knowing this. The Office of Guardian was formally created. The first vote was unanimous. She had not expected that. She stood in the same hotel conference room where she'd first laid the documents on the table, and she looked at the ring in her hand, and she thought about a woman she'd never met who had somehow described her to a grieving husband with enough precision that he had recognized her in the second week and spent 4 months working up to it. She put the ring on. The family stood. She called her cousin that evening, something she hadn't been able to do freely in months, using her own phone, which had been returned to her with an apology from secretary, that had been so careful and formal, it had almost made her laugh. "You're still there?" the cousin said. "Still here. Is the job still good?" Amara looked across the estate's courtyard to where Jehun was standing in the stone garden, his back to her, hands in his pockets, looking at the arrangement of rocks and water that held his wife's memory. "It's complicated," she said. "Complicated how?" "In most of the important ways," she said. She went to him. The garden was cold, the season having turned while she was otherwise occupied, and the stones held a different quality in the autumn air. Less grief, she thought, or maybe the same amount, differently held. He heard her and turned. They had not talked about what existed between them in any direct terms. They had existed in the space that 2 people occupy when they've shown each other the real version and are waiting to see what the other person does with it. It was not a comfortable space. It was not meant to be. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what comes next. For the compact. For this." She gestured between them, which was not a graceful gesture, but was an honest one. He looked at her with the steadiness that she had initially read as coldness and now understood was simply the form his attention took. Total, unmoving, without performance. "I'm not a man who makes promises easily," he said. "I know that. I'm also not a man who says things he doesn't mean. I know that too." "Then I will say this," he said. "In 4 months, I have watched you navigate an impossible situation with the kind of intelligence that makes other people's intelligence look decorative. I have watched you take something I gave you without explanation and make it into something larger than I understood it could be. I have watched you," he stopped. Breathed. The habit of suppression pressing back against the choice to speak. He made the choice again. "I have watched you and understood, more times than I can count, why she described you the way she did." She was quiet. "I'm not asking you to stay because of the compact," he said. "I am asking you to stay because you're the only person I have met in 3 years who has made this house feel like it contains something worth coming home to." She looked at him, at the man behind the controlled surface, not the Mafia boss, not the grieving husband, not the strategic mind who had placed a ring on her pillow without explanation and then spent 6 days arranging Korean lessons to make sure she could say for herself what needed to be said. The man who had driven her to a bank in Myeongdong and sat across a table from her while she held his dead wife's handwriting, and had said, "So are you," without hesitation. "I'm not staying as the housekeeper," she said. "No," he agreed. "That position has been substantially modified. I'm not staying as Soo-yeon's replacement." "You told me that the first night," he said. "I heard you." "I'm staying as myself," she said. "With full information, this time, and a real contract. Secretary O will have it drafted by morning. I want to review it before I sign it. I would expect nothing less." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she crossed the courtyard, through the stone garden, and stood close enough that she could see every line of his face in the cold evening light. She reached up and adjusted the collar of his coat, which had turned under at some point, A purely practical gesture, the kind that people make for each other when the distance between them has become something else. He stilled under her hands the way he went still when he was paying very close attention. "Tell me what you want," she said quietly. "I want," he said, "to learn what it means to be in a room with someone and not calculate every sentence before I say it. That's going to take time. I'm aware. I'm not a patient person," she said. "You are the most patient person I have ever met," he said. "You simply disguise it as directness." She smiled at that. It was unexpected, the smile, from her and apparently from him too, because something changed in his face at the sight of it, something that had been sealed for 3 years, cracking open along the edge, carefully, the way you open something old and valuable, with attention to what might be inside. She stepped back. She offered her hand, not the ring hand, the other one, a handshake, direct and real, the gesture of two people beginning an agreement with full information. He looked at it. He looked at her. He took it. 3 months after that evening, Amara Osei gave a lecture at a cultural foundation in Seoul. Not the same foundation, a real one with a solvent endowment, on the history of compact agreements in East Asian organized crime and the role of document preservation in restorative justice frameworks. She delivered it in Korean, imperfectly and sincerely, with the annotated original documents projected behind her. Shin Myri was in the front row. She had become, in those 3 months, something between a colleague and a friend, which in the world they now both inhabited was a rarer and more valuable thing than it sounds. In the back of the room, in a suit that had been made for his body and no one else's, Kang Ji-hoon stood and watched her speak without moving, without taking his eyes from her, with the total focused attention that she now understood was the most consistent and enduring form of regard he possessed. She knew he was there without looking. She had developed, over months of learning to read a room that was trying not to be read, a sense for his particular quality of presence, the way he occupied space without performing it. She finished the lecture. The applause was substantial. She looked to the back of the room. He dipped his chin. One small, precise movement that in anyone else's communication system would have been insufficient, and in his was everything. She put the ring on the lectern, with a projector caught it, and sent light fracturing across the ceiling of the room like scattered stars. The record had been corrected. The archive was honest. She had stayed, not because she was placed, not because she was needed, not because a dead woman had described her to a man who recognized her in the second week and spent 4 months working up to saying so, but because she had looked at all of it clearly, with full information, and made the calculation. It was, she thought, a very good situation. She picked up the ring and put it back on her finger. And in the back of the room, for the first time in 3 years, Kang Ji-hoon smiled. If there's one thing this story is about, it's this: real power doesn't announce itself. It shows up, reads the room, finds the true document, and builds something honest in place of what was hidden. She didn't come into this world to be rescued. She came to correct the record. And she did. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It means more than you know. Subscribe so you never miss the next one, because the stories we tell next are going to go places you won't expect. And if someone in your life needs a story about a woman who walked into an impossible situation and came out holding the keys, share this with them. See you in the next one.